This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. From Microbe TV, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, a special episode recorded on October 18th, 2019. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about viruses. I'm at Georgia State University. My guest is Professor of Economics and author of How Economics Shapes Science. Paula Stephan, welcome to TWiV.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with you.
I appreciate the time. I saw your book on Amy Rosenfeld's shelf a few months ago. Amy and I worked together.
Right.
And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "Give it to me." And I flipped through it and I said, "I have to read this."
That's
and so
great.
I actually bought it and read it.
That's even better.
And then I said, I wanted to support you. And then I knew I was coming here to visit Georgia Tech and Georgia State. So fortunately, we were able to hook up. You just got back from Europe.
Yes, I just got back from Europe yesterday.
Good thing, because if I had tried a day earlier, it wouldn't have worked.
Wouldn't have worked.
So I want to talk about a few of the points in your book, because I think our listeners, who are some scientists and many non-scientists, everyone needs to know about the economic state of science as you have portrayed it. I wanted to find out first, though, you're a professor of economics.
That's
here.
Right.
How do you train to be a professor of economics?
How do you train to be a professor? Well, I took the usual path. I was an undergraduate at Grinnell College, and then I went to the University of Michigan and got a PhD in economics, and was doing models of labor economics. And I got interested in issues related to the scientific workforce. And one thing led to another, and I kind of ended up specializing in issues related to science.
So how early in your life did you know you wanted to be an economist?
Not real early. I always liked to count, and I always liked numbers. But I went to college majoring in history. But I'm old, and I was very influenced by John F. Kennedy, and I was very influenced by the war on poverty. And and economics, I thought, was a way to address some of the social issues of the time. So that's what drew me to economics. And clearly I ended up on a very different path. But years and years ago, I worked for the Appalachian Regional Commission for a very brief period of time.
So is it fair to say that you specialize in the economics of science?
Yeah, I think it's completely fair to say that. And I have for at least the last 25 years, probably.
And is this common in the economics field?
It wasn't, but it's really quite a growing field. As you said, I just got back from Europe, and I was invited to lecture at the Collège de France about issues related to risk-taking in science, which is one topic I'm very interested in. I was on a dissertation, an outside reviewer for a dissertation at a university in Pisa, Italy, and I'm on an advisory board in Milan and work with researchers there. And it's really, there are a lot of people, and with somebody from the University of Leuven in Belgium, KU Leuven, I run a program at the National Bureau of Economic Research every summer on the science of science funding. So I'm particularly interested in science funding and workforce issues. And we have a lot of people who apply and are doing research in the area.
I have to say, after having read your book, if I were going into science now, I might not.
Well, I mean, one of the messages about my book is that data about careers has not been very forthcoming in the United States. I think the French word for it is bien caché, very well hidden. Mm-hmm. And it's been only recently, I started serving on National Academy committees relating to this topic beginning in 1996, when Shirley Tillman invited me to be a member of Trends in the Early Careers of Life Scientists. And I became very, very aware, I think, of career issues. Then I helped run all the numbers from the survey of doctorate recipients and survey of earned doctorates. and became very familiar with patterns. I've been on an Academy postdoc committee, and I just finished serving on the Next Generation National Academy Committee. It's Next Generation of Biomedical Scientists. And I was also in the Advisory Council for NIGMS for 3 years. And we talked about workforce issues a lot when I was there. So, I mean, I know the numbers. Mm-hmm. I know the dismal probability that somebody's going to get a faculty position now if they get a PhD in the biomedical sciences. It's about 12%, somewhere in there. And an awful lot of people are going to end up not doing research and not using the skills they were trained for. And so one of the things I think that's great is that Next Gen Committee, Ron Daniels, who's president of Hopkins, he was the chair. And while the committee was meeting, he got 37 institutions to agree to start tracking their PhDs and their postdocs. And the data is really quite good. I just looked at it this morning for a talk I'm giving next week someplace, and you can look at 5 and 10-year outcomes for 37 institutions right now. And that's the best and the finest grain data we've had for people to look at.
So is that available for
It's available
anyone?
for anybody. It's right on. I can tell you what it is if I get my computer to come alive here. Okay.
I went into science. I started a PhD program in 1975. Mm-hmm. And I was just like everyone else, completely naive. I just liked science, and I just went through all the steps you needed to do it. And I'm amazed that it worked.
Right.
That I had a career.
But you were also part of it. I'm not saying anything about your personal ability, but you were also one of the lucky last cohorts, I think, to get a job when the system was still growing quite a bit and when we weren't producing that many PhDs. And we are just producing a huge number of PhDs.
Right.
And I think that's because the way we get the work done in the labs is by training people and then convincing them they should become a postdoc. And this is where economics really comes in. It's a cheap way to get the work done. And we haven't been very forthcoming with people about what their career options are. And I think everybody goes into this because they really like science, you know. You don't go into it if you don't like science. And somebody says you can have an assistantship and you can earn money and you can do science. Right. And it all sounds pretty good. But it's been only recently that we've started talking to people about what the job prospects are like out there.
Well, that was something I wanted to talk about, this idea of populating labs, and you discuss it with students and postdocs, cheap labor, temporary labor, new ideas coming in, right?
Right.
And you call it a pyramid scheme, which is what I've done too. And I call it a pyramid scheme because there aren't enough jobs for the people that we hire. So one of the issues you raise is that departments don't provide information. And no one told me this when I started, but of course it was a little easier then. Although the NIH pay lines were starting to go down. And I remember asking the director of the biomedical sciences program if I could make it. And she said, Vinny, if you really want to do science, if you're passionate, you'll find a way. And that's all very well and good, but if today it may not be enough to tell someone that they could do it if they want to.
I don't think it is. I mean, I think there are a lot of people out there who really want it and really are trying really hard and are killing themselves almost to get it. And it's just not going to be within their grasp, I think.
But as you say, if departments tell students this ahead of time, they're going to lose the geese that incubate the golden eggs. Those are your words, right?
Well, there's a possibility. Although, I do think there are people who will want to stay the course. Lots of people who want to stay the course, even though they know the odds are low. And I think that's for the same reason that people really like science and they like it enough. But I do think that we do them a disservice to make them sound like a job's going to be out there for them. Going back to your question, this is called the Coalition for Next Generation of Life Scientists, and it says see the data here.
Oh, I see. Good.
Okay, and if you click on see the data, you can divide it by U.S. and non-U.S. institutions, and then you can go to U.S. schools, and you can see them by PhD program and postdoc program.
Great.
I just had UCSF's data up today. And I will say one thing I think is pretty encouraging is that these institutions seem to have been able to locate about 88% of their alumni.
That's great.
Which is pretty good.
That's
which
great.
Could not have been done 15 years ago at all. I mean, LinkedIn and things like that
Exactly.
have really helped.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we used to track some of these data for training grants.
Right. Exactly. I mean, that's where institutions used to be really interested and still are, is you need this data for training grants, particularly,
But we didn't always find everyone.
That's right. I mean,
especially if they left science, right?
I sat in a lot of those NIGMS committees where we looked at where they couldn't be found. But anyhow, that's
okay.
That's
We're gonna put that out there, and I think that's one thing that should be shared with potential students.
Oh, I really think so. And the other thing I think it's very important, and what I like about this is it's institution specific, because some institutions may be very good at training people for certain kinds of jobs, and other institutions don't get those kind of jobs at all. And students need to know.
So basically, we train too many PhDs because we need them for the work, correct?
I think so.
And so what's the solution?
I think I think the long-run solution is we've really got to stabilize the workforce, and that's to create more staff science positions. I see staff science, the people, I talk to so many PhD students and postdocs over my career. I give lectures lots of places. I meet with people. I get an incredible number of emails. And there are lots of people out there who love science and would be really happy being a staff scientist, earning $60,000 to $100,000 a year and having some independence, but not being in a tenure track position, not being totally responsible for raising funds. And I think the thing that keeps us from doing that is they're more expensive. And in the past, they've had fringe benefits that postdocs haven't had. Postdocs now have more fringe benefits. But it used to be, I figured it out, and I should have looked this morning, but I think a postdoc, people are paying about $17 an hour, because postdocs are so desperate to get out of jail, as I call it. They're desperately trying to publish an article in Science or Nature. They're killing themselves. They're putting in really long hours, and they're getting paid a set rate that's pretty much set by NIH, although it depends on geographic area somewhat. And it works out to $17 to $18 an hour. And a staff scientist, it's unlikely they're going to work 2,500 hours a year. So, and they cost more, so they work fewer hours. So they're more expensive.
Don't have to be an economist to understand that.
No, you don't have to be an economist to understand it. But it doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And so I've argued for a very long time to increase postdoc salaries. I mean, and in our report in 1998, Trends in Their Early Careers that Shirley Tillman chaired, that was one of our recommendations. Didn't go anywhere. I was on the 2012 Workforce Committee report for NIH. We recommended an increase in postdoc salaries. It went a wee little way. And then we had the postdoc committee report and the Rethinking the Postdoc that Greg Petzko chaired. And we made that recommendation. And by the way, it took quite a bit of time before the committee was willing to make that recommendation. And I wrote part of the rationale for it, and I thought it was based on two reasons. Equity. I mean, people at that time were earning about $43,000 a year in a postdoc, and classmates of theirs who graduated with an undergraduate degree and never did any more training, 7 years after they were out, were earning more than $43,000 a year, right? So there's equity, but there's also in terms of efficiency. It's just very inefficient. It's sending the wrong signals that these people are really cheap and we don't staff labs right. So we made a recommendation to increase postdoc salaries. They increased a little bit. But what really raised, and They did go up, but it was the Fair Labor Standards Act that suddenly said if you don't pay 47,300 or something like that, you're going to have to pay time and a half or start tracking people. And institutions got online right away. So when you got a rule, then institutions had to make a decision about they complied. Now, the question is whether, and now salaries are around $50,000 for postdocs. The question is, it's too early to know whether that had any effect on what people hire, but my suspicion is not, because it's still not a big enough shock to the system. I mean, you got to make them more expensive before that's going to happen. And I hope that getting information out there makes people rethink.
The idea of staff scientists has been around. You know John Udell at NIH? He's been...
Yeah, I know who he is, but
he's been talking about... Now, NIH does have a limited number of intramural, right?
Intramural, they have some staff scientists. And most people think it's been a pretty successful model. And, I mean, you can find individual labs. Lots of individual labs have one or two staff scientists.
But it depends on the lab to fund them. Right?
And it depends on the lab to fund them, and labs are worried about coming up with the funds to fund them. And
you can get 2 postdocs for one, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Is it unreasonable to ask universities to help with staff scientist positions?
Well, I don't think it's unreasonable to ask, but I think universities, it'll be a hard sell, I think. I will say one of the things that the Next Gen Committee recommended was that NIH start sharing some money with universities to start thinking about new solutions for how to solve some of these issues. So I would hope that if we got into a model in which not all the money's going through grants, but we have some kind of flexibility in some funds, that we might see universities trying to do something different. But, this comes back to economics in a sense. Universities are obsessed with their rankings, and rankings very much depend upon the amount of funding they're getting. And so I think that that's just been a big problem pushing the system also.
Why are they obsessed with ranking?
Well, I think people think that it's the best way to get money from your alums and the best way to get prestigious candidates. And it seems to be running the whole world. I mean, I just got back from Europe. I've been in France, and France is so obsessed. The Shanghai rankings were produced by a small institution in Shanghai, China. And on the Shanghai rankings of institutions, France didn't do well at all. They have no institution in the top 50. I think they have a couple in the top 100. And they're so obsessed with it. So France's whole solution to this is to they think, and it's partially true, rankings are not friendly to small institutions. And so what are the French doing? They're combining institutions. They're spending a lot of money combining institutions to move up in the rankings. And it's not at all clear this is a good use of resources.
So these PhDs who don't get faculty jobs, what do they end up doing? And is their training worth where they end up? Well,
that's a great question. And one of the things that it's really unfortunate, we just really don't know. I mean, we know if they end up in non-tenure track positions at universities. We know if they end up doing research in industry, okay? But if they're not doing research, we don't really know for sure what they're doing. I was just looking at some of this data from the Next Gen report, and you see these people who we know they're not doing science, and we don't know for sure what they're doing, okay? And I think one of the things that really got my attention is for the workforce report that we did for NIH. The big trend is in non-research, non-academic jobs. That's where the increase has been. And so there's been, one thing that kind of disturbs me is a lot of institutions now are training people for what they think those jobs are in their PhD programs. For example, being a reporter, being a science writer, teaching, etc. And we just don't know if there are that many of those jobs out there. And furthermore, I'm not really sure you need a PhD for a lot of those jobs. And so, to me, it seems a little disingenuous to start counting those. And I think instead we should start counseling people earlier on and try to get them in great master's programs that will help them do that. It'll be much more efficient.
Now, I've heard this, that there are many companies that want master's level people to do assays development that doesn't require a PhD, and we should be encouraging people to do that.
I think that's true. I mean, it's very hard. I will say that industry isn't always forthcoming on what exactly they want. I mean, industry sometimes tells committees that we don't really like academically trained postdocs. We'd rather have postdocs. If we're going to have them, we want to train them. We want them to do. But also, I mean, I've gotten letters from people who have PhDs who say they feel they were lied to because industry says to them, we would have rather had you with a master's degree. You know, that we have places for you with a master's degree, and we don't have that many places for PhDs.
Well, that's difficult because you consider an undergraduate about to graduate trying to decide what to do. How do they get the information on what they want to do and what degree would be best for them?
Oh, I think that's very hard. Although I will say Mike Lauer at NIH loves to talk about how his son's an engineer, I believe, and what good training, what good counseling he thought his son got as a sophomore and junior in college with being able to do internships and things with a company and really getting a sense of whether that was something he was interested in. And I think we need more of those kind of experiences in science. I really do.
So ideally, we should only train enough PhD students for the faculty positions that are available, and the research should be done by staff scientist type.
No, I didn't quite say that. That's going much further than I said. I mean, we want to train people for faculty positions. There's a lot of research done in the government. Okay, there's a lot of research done at nonprofit institutions, and there are a number of PhDs working at companies doing research. But I just think we don't want to be training a lot of people who want to do research who aren't going to be able to do research. That's where the oversupply is. We've got a large number of people who say their goal is to do research, and there's not going to be a research job for them out there.
You said that about 12% of PhDs get an academic research position.
That's
right?
what it looks like.
What should the number be? Do we know?
Well, years ago, for people who graduated about 5 years before you, it was about 55%. That's a big difference.
That's not a bad number because you do want some competition, right?
Oh, no, you absolutely want competition. You absolutely want competition. I wouldn't say that at all. It's just, I think 12% is rather low odds. Okay? And I think the other thing is that so many people hang around thinking it's going to work out for them, you know?
All right, let's talk a little bit about universities and faculty. You talk about this in one of your chapters, and you say that in 35% of medical schools, tenure has no financial guarantee. In 52%, it has some guarantee, but in 13%, it's total salary. And so I'm in the middle. My institution is about 40%, although I don't have a contract that says that. It's kind of word of mouth.
Right.
The dean sends us a letter and says, this is what you get. And then a new dean comes and it changes. So what you say is that the risk is being shifted from the university to the faculty.
I absolutely believe that.
Why is that? Because they can do it?
Yeah. These jobs are, I mean, we've just been talking about the job market, right? I think universities have been really good at shifting risk. I mean, think about it. Even for your IRB approval, in a sense, my IRB is done outside of Georgia State. They hire an outside firm to train you, etc. I mean, universities are exporting risk in many, many ways. Everybody, it's not just universities. It's the whole model of the world right now, I think, to export risk. But I really think universities, particularly with medical schools, export risk. But if you also look, you've been to Georgia State. I mean, you've been there are people here in soft money positions who are doing research. It's quite common at most universities. And I love Stephen Quake. He's a biophysicist at Stanford. He says for these people, it's funding or famine,
That's right.
really. And I really think it's a good way of thinking about it. And I'm very concerned that I think risk-taking is declining in science. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the major reasons. I mean, you can't afford to take risk if your whole livelihood is on the line.
But an undergraduate institution will typically give you 9 months' salary.
Right.
Right. So they're assuming some of the risk.
That's absolutely right. And I mean, there are a number of universities that give you 9 full months' salary, and they don't expect you to write off your 9 months' salary. But a lot of those are top institutions. If at least it was true, Princeton 5 years ago, nobody was buying out their salary for their academic year at all. And I think you can find a number of institutions that do that, but I also think you'll find a number of institutions that do that, but also have strong incentives for people to be buying out some of their time, because people get, the incentives are that you'll get part of the indirect back and all kinds of things. And also, and get more recognition in some sense for doing it.
Yeah, people I talk to here said if they raise beyond their 3 months, it comes back to them in some way,
right?
Which is a good incentive.
Yeah, it's
right?
good. Yeah.
Is this a changing scenario? So my view was when I started, universities should teach, and I've noticed over time they become businesses.
That's right.
They're trying to. We have hired many business people over the years, and we're never there to try and break even and make money. And why is it not just teaching anymore?
Well, I can't remember if I said it in my book, but I've said it at least since my book, that I think universities have become high-end shopping malls, that they're really, really into building extraordinary research space. Research spaces, they love to build it, and then they rent it out.
They rent it
to
exactly.
faculty.
Yes.
And how do they rent it out? They rent it out in terms of salary, particularly if people earn a soft money, and indirect recovery. All right? And they do this to enhance their reputation and to build more resources in some sense. I really think that's the model that universities are in right now. And it's very hard to think about how you stop that. It's like a nuclear arms race. And you can look at those. NSF collects data on research space. I think I included it in the book, but I keep updating it. And of course, where has there been great growth in research space at universities? It's been in the biomedical sciences. And that happened after the doubling. And of course, it takes a while for things to really. And on a number of campuses, we have some excess space that's almost being mothballed or being underused. And that's very expensive. And economists like to think about incidents. Somebody's going to pay for that, okay? And a lot of times, it's not that department that's going to pay for it or the medical school. It's coming out of another program at the university.
So the way I see it is that we're turning universities into research institutes, because a lot of these faculty who come and bring grants, they actually don't want to teach.
That's right.
And some of them, in fact, shouldn't be teaching.
I can't remember if I said this in the book, but I really believe that we'd be much better off to have some more independent research institutes that are doing exactly this, that don't even have any pretense that they're doing training. Okay? Because I think you can do good research without training. You cannot do good training without research. But I think we can have some very strong research institutes. In many ways, I think Janella Farms, and now just called Janella, has been exploring in this way, and we can see other. And to me, they also are appealing because they're not in the business of creating PhDs. And I think I said in the book that abstinence is the best form of birth control. And if you can't give a PhD, okay, you're not going to create a PhD. And I think it's quite interesting that the U.S. took on this model that almost all our research was going to be done at universities. I mean, not all countries do that. And I think it's probably led us to have a number of problems and unintended consequences that we might not have had if we'd chosen a different model.
Do we know why we got to this point where universities are doing most of the research?
Yeah, I think it was all, science emerged absolutely triumphant after the war, right? I mean, it brought us penicillin and it brought us the bomb and a number radar and really helped win the war. And, Vannevar Bush wrote Science, the Endless Frontier, which was a really, really well-articulated plea for why we need to support science and how it's our future and how it's a future for economic growth. And it was his goal to put more money into NIH, which already existed, and his goal to create NSF. And those were very directed towards universities. And that's where the incentives were, and that's where the money went. If you look at other countries like France, CNRS, you have research institutes that are standalone or partner with universities, and that's a different model. And I think you'd need a political scientist more than an economist to tell you how those different research trajectories took off.
So I like that idea of having some institutes doing research, but of course, as you said, to have a great university, you also need people doing research there.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I mean, I would not at all want to totally move one way or the other. I just think the balance is wrong right now. I think a little bit of competition, a little bit of other things nipping at the system could be very, very good. Okay? It's not a one way to do it.
All right. I wanted to touch on something which maybe a lot of scientists don't think about, and that is the idea that science is a public good.
Oh, yeah, right.
Explain that to our listeners.
Oh, okay. Well, economists have a concept of something's a public good if when you consume it, it's not used up. So I'll give you an example the classic example of a public good is the lighthouse. All right? A lighthouse is built and a ship goes by and the ship does not use up the light, but the ship benefits from the light. Okay? And so the idea is that private firms underinvest in public goods because you can be a free rider. A free rider means you can use it and not pay. So if they come to you as the captain of a ship, you'd say, oh, no, I never pass that rocky cliff. I don't need the lighthouse, because you think somebody else will put it up, right? So the whole argument as to why we need to support socially, or the government needs to support such things, is so they have great use and we wouldn't get them, or we would underinvest in them as a society without the government doing it. And you can argue that basic research is a perfect example of a public good, because when it's used by one person, it's not used up by other people. And private firms tend to underinvest in basic research because they're worried they'll be free riders. I mean, they could discover something and it's so basic another firm can use it and it will help their profits, etc. And that's very much an argument in Science, the Endless Frontier, and very much an argument made by Kenneth Arrow and other economists in the late 40s, early 50s, and early 60s. That's a strong case for why we need to invest as a society in research.
And then you also make the point that by publishing, scientists have to publish, and that makes it public, right?
Right, but it also makes it theirs. So I think it's a very interesting kind of flip on private property. That, I mean, you have an idea, you work it out, you publish it, you make it public, but the only time it really becomes yours truly is once you make it public, because you get priority by making it public. The sociologist Robert Merton did really interesting work about this, and I think it's very interesting to think about it.
I think it's very clever.
Oh yeah, it's very clever.
I think brilliant.
It's a very clever system, and science has had this system for generations.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about motivation. You spend a lot of time talking about why people become scientists, and I think you wrote, no one would, and this is quoting someone, I don't remember who, no one would become a scientist solely for the money. Although you point out some scientists can make a lot of money, but it's a minority. So part of it is fame, right?
Right.
Honors and rewards.
I call it the puzzle, the ribbon, and the gold in the book, I think. So, I mean, I really want to go back to the fact that I think people who go into science really do it because they like science. And puzzle solving is, in some sense, one way of thinking about that. So I think that's a big part of the reward is puzzle solving. I mean, one thing that worries me about the shopping model is you may be taking a lot of the puzzles out of it. A lot of that kind of satisfaction goes away. And the ribbon, I think, priority. I mean, seeing your, publishing, having people invite you to lecture, knowing how many citations you have. I mean, metrics have become the whole game here, So that's very important. And, in that respect, I don't think scientists are unlike other people. I mean, people like recognition. Napoleon supposedly once said, "Give me enough ribbon and I could conquer the world," which I think is just a wonderful quote. And I mean, think of all the prizes there are in science and all the ways people can measure how they're recognized and important. And then there has been some money for some people in science. I mean, there have been some patents that have paid off very, very well. And there's some endowed chairs that aren't, where people are doing reasonably well, not in the millions, but reasonably well.
A Nobel laureate once told me, it doesn't matter if you're right or wrong, just publish first. Which I don't really like, but the point is, if you get it in there first, it's yours, and even if it's slightly wrong, right? But you think prizes really never motivated me, but I don't know about other people, like Nobel prizes or other kinds of prizes. I think
certain prizes, like the Nobel, the probability of getting it is so low that it's hard for me to see that it's that much of a motivator. Although I do know people who spend a lot of time thinking about whether they're going to get the Nobel. Yes. Okay, but that's kind of after they think they're on the list that might get called. I'm sure we've all met people like that. But I think that at a lower level, a number of prizes not necessarily motivate people, but they certainly make them feel good about their career and validate their career. And I think people like validation.
Eric Fang and Arturo Casadevall have argued that prizes corrupt science, that they encourage cheating and falsification. And what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think there are lots of ways that science could be corrupted, and I don't think prizes are the major way that science is corrupted. I think the need to get a grant I think there are lots of other things besides prizes that might lead to corruption.
Yeah, and of course, to get a grant, you need to publish, and so that's the ultimate source, where you publish something that, I think you mentioned in your book someone who was publishing a paper a week, and they were all falsified.
Right, they were all falsified. I think that was the guy at Bell Labs.
It's remarkable. You've also written about pay gap between men and women. Mm-hmm. So where do we stand today in professors? I know it's different for every field, but is it narrowing or is it still?
It's definitely been narrowing. And I didn't go and look. I haven't looked at the data in the last few years, so I don't want to go on record saying something that's incorrect here. But we've seen there's some really good work that indicates that the gap is narrowing. Some. Donna Ginther, I recommend at the University of Kansas, has done some really, really interesting work on gender gaps and the narrowing.
Let's talk just briefly about indirect costs, which you also you explain all of these things in your book. The idea that the government is giving a university money to do research, and they have to pay for the lights and the water and so forth. How did that arise? And is that a reasonable, especially since whatever research is done is often owned or patented by the university? Why should they get indirect costs?
Well, the history of indirect cost is right after NIH was set up in its, well, not NIH set up, but when NSF was set up, the indirect was set at either 10 or 15%. I forget. And it was set pretty much by law as the way it was set up. And NIH, of course, had been in existence before, but only had a couple of institutes. And as it grew, it had indirect set at 15%. And there's still one grant, training grants are still 15% indirect. I mean, that's about the last vintage of this that you can find. And it may be why institutions don't like training grants in a way, is they have such low indirect on them. But if you go back and look at the history of indirect, universities, beginning in the early 60s, began to feel that they needed more federal support for research. And so one of the biggest arguments was that the federal government should just give them block funding to hire faculty. And the PCAS, the President's Council on Science, made such a recommendation. Didn't go anywhere. And they really pushed in the early 60s to do that. And I think after it became evident that the federal government wasn't just going to write a check to each university for a certain number of millions of dollars, the idea of growing indirect and having indirect get bigger really took off, and it was pretty successful. Now, of course, universities love to complain that indirect isn't high enough and that they're going broke during research. I've heard it every place I've gone, and I even heard a dean say that he thought he'd get rid of grants at his university because it was costing them too much. But he was the rare case. I mean, people are going to cry all the way to the bank on this indirect. It's not a good system. I think everybody would agree that it's not a good system, but I don't think there's any political will anywhere to change it. I mean, the last National Academy Committee that looked at some of these issues, I mean, that was their consensus. Not great, but better than nothing here, okay? So that's the tradition, and every university has a slightly different indirect because it's audited. It's audited. Right,
it can be 30% to over 100%,
yeah, right.
And the public has really little idea about this. If you say, I got a $500,000 NIH grant, and they don't realize, then you get another 70% on top of it.
That's right.
And they don't understand it at all.
And lots of institutions use that indirect as incentives within the institution.
I think that it would really help the tight NIH pay lines to take some of that away. And I understand, as you say, it's not going to happen, but that would be an easy way to increase.
Well, another way to fix some tight pay lines is to not allow as much salary write-off on grants. I mean, because that's really an incentive for universities to hire people in soft money positions and to grow their institutions that way. And so that's another way. Wally Schaefer, who's just retired from NIH, he did an interesting paper that shows that 50% of all grant funding is for salaries. Yeah. Now, we don't know what part of that's soft and what part is not soft, but it's a big piece. And NIH initially wasn't set up to be paying that kind of salary support.
I agree. When I write grant proposals, most of the money is for salary. Right. And that's why you can't run a lab with one R01 anymore.
That's true.
You can't pay everyone that you need to do the work. So it's unfortunate, but I agree. I think that's a good idea to try and lessen the amount of salary that's paid. I don't know how that would happen, but that would certainly help. Another issue, and we mentioned this earlier, the doubling of the NIH budget. Right. Tell us why that wasn't a good thing in the end.
Oh, well, I think got to always watch what you wish for, right? In a sense. Well, I mean, it set off just an incredible competition across institutions. in terms of the amount of space, new space that came online, huge increase in research space. And I think the thing that is so remarkable is NIH said from the very beginning, this is a doubling, but it's not going to keep growing afterwards, and they said it they were loud and clear about it. But universities just didn't simply want to believe that, They saw the doubling and they just said, this is the time for us to grow. And the way you recruit great faculty is through space. So we got all this extra space, and we also got this big expansion of very successful researchers who could bring in 4 or 5 R01 grants at the same time. And the competition to bring them in. So universities got new space. They went on a real hiring binge to hire very top researchers. So you got lots of competition at the very top to bring in these very expensive researchers with all their grants, because you needed to fill your new space. And they produced a lot more PhDs because they had, And then, of course, NIH, the train slowed down, went flat. And everybody was like, what a surprise. And it was very clear it couldn't sustain.
And the pay lines didn't increase afterwards.
Well, the pay lines did increase during the doubling, but you got a lot of people that had multiple grants. Pay lines increased definitely, but then soon afterwards, they went back down.
You say by 2009, in part because of real decreases that NIH experienced, success rates were lower than they had been before the doubling.
That's right. Amazing, isn't it?
And so
we just invited more and more people to the dance.
Exactly. We didn't solve the basic problem. And then there was the Recovery Act of 2009.
Right.
What was the idea behind there?
The idea.
There are $21 billion for science and engineering.
Right. I mean, the idea was that if we're going to put money into the economy, science should get some of it, right? And there was successful negotiation going on late at night. Arlen Specter, who was the champion of getting it for science, he was a third-time cancer survivor at the time. And I mean, everybody says it's Arlen Specter who got that deal put in. NIH used it one way, NSF used it a different way. I don't think we should think of it as a failure in any way, but they were short-term grants and they kind of funded different kinds of things. And it put an awful lot of pressure on an awful lot of people to turn in grants really fast.
You say in your book that the U.S. spends between 0.3 and 0.4% of its gross domestic product on research and development at universities and medical schools. Is that enough, or should it be higher?
Well, I think I think that we should spend. I think all the economic evaluations of returns to scientific research make one think that the returns are pretty high. It's very hard to say an exact percent or even a range of 10 to 12 or whatever, but they're pretty good. And I think we're underinvesting as a country in scientific research. Now, the next question is, are we doing the right kind of research with that budget? I might have a different answer on that.
Well, that's hard to tell, right?
Right.
Because
it's very hard to tell.
That's why we call it research.
Right.
Because we have to find out, and we have to stumble onto things.
That's right. But I am a little concerned, and I'm not the only one, that there's so much pressure for results and applicable results right away that we need a little bit more of a balance towards some risky things in our portfolio.
Yeah, so that's another part of your book where you talk about how NIH is not really encouraging risk.
I think that's true.
You really need something that looks like it's going to work.
That's true, I think.
And you would argue that you should have some component of risk, not all of it, right?
Well, I think that review panels in a funding agency needs to have a portfolio approach to what they fund. I mean, we're all, as investors, we all think about, or I hope most people think about what their portfolio is, and they don't buy stocks just one at a time. They buy them in terms of how they relate to their portfolio. And I think we should fund, as a funding agency, I just come back from I've done work for the European Research Council, and I'm analyzing some of the European Research Council's data. And I think, and there's real strong evidence that they're quite risk averse, particularly for young applicants for the starter grants. And I think the thing is that panels, it's very easy to see the downside on grants and to say, oh, we can't fund that because it might not work. But they don't look at the end of the day and say, oh, we ended up only with proposals that we're sure are going to work. We need some kind of mixture in there. And somehow we need nudges. Economists love the concept of a nudge. You need a nudge to contribute to your retirement account. You need a nudge for making a donor, giving your eyes after, etc. We need to nudge panels to think about their portfolio. And I really think that's absent in the funding system.
You quote Roger Kornberg, if the work you propose to do isn't virtually certain of success, then it won't be funded.
That's exactly right.
Which is
I think that's really
horrible.
True. Yeah. And James Rothman, the day after James Rothman won the prize on NPR, he made a really impassioned statement about how everything he did failed for the first 5 years. And he's pretty sure he couldn't have gotten support from NIH today with that kind of failure rate.
Yet all these examples, we're still stuck with the same system.
That's right.
Plus, you point out that the system lowers morale because you fail, you submit over and over, to which I would ask, does it matter? We have so many people waiting in the wings. It doesn't sound right, but does morale actually make people leave?
Well, I don't know, but I think morale contributes a lot to the quality of one's research. Okay. And the questions one asks, I really do.
The other issue is that you say the grant system provides incentives to get as much funding as possible for your work, even if it doesn't make you more productive.
Oh, that's absolutely true, I think. Well, I think universities really put pressure on people to get more funding and more funding. I will say, I think there have been some, NIGMS has been changing its funding. Mm-hmm. It has the Mirror program, which I'm no longer on NIGMS Council. Right. But as far as I understand, the movement has been for one grant of a longer time, I think 5 to 6 years, and for more money, all right, rather than multiple grants. And I see that if that's operationally what's going on, I see that as a positive step. Because I'll tell you, in some work I'm doing with a French researcher named Jacques Maras, we look at what happens to the quality of people's research if they get the same amount of money, but they get it in multiple grants. And we see that people looking at researchers who have the same overall amount of money, the researchers who have more grants bringing in that same amount of money, they're producing more papers, but of lower quality. And it's kind of like you got to mail something off to every one of your... You okay? Yeah.
You mentioned that the Howard Hughes Medical Institute supports people, not projects.
Right.
Is that something the NIH should consider?
Well, I think that's I think I'm a big fan of how it's worked at Hughes. I think the big question is it scalable? Because, I think that one reason the Hughes program is so strong is that they're not evaluating 10,000 people. They're evaluating 1,000 people or something like that for their 350 places. And each year they're only, I think, appointing something like 50 new investigators. So I think one of the big challenges U.S. science has, and science in general, is how it's become so big. And how do we evaluate people in a system that's that big?
Also, if you evaluate a person, it's harder when you're just starting, right? Because there's less.
That's true. But I still think that people still have ideas, and people can still come, and you're interviewed, and you talk about it. And at least, and I will say the European Research Council, for the starter grants, for people who've been out 1 to 5 years, you come for an interview. And I think interviews are a positive thing.
And of course, then there's your pedigree, which will count as well.
Right, absolutely. And there's also the impact factor of the journals you publish in.
Which brings me just to that. I wanted to talk a little about that because you do discuss it. In fact, I didn't know that in some countries you get a publishing bonus for Cell Science or Nature.
Well, in China, definitely. In a number of countries.
Up to 30% of your salary?
Well, it depends, but I can show you data. I'm very interested in, with two researchers in Italy, we got the journal Science to give us all their submission data for 10 years. So we know the country of the corresponding author. And we see a huge increase in submissions from people in countries that started a policy of providing money. And there are some, in China right now, there are some institutions that would pay up to about $100,000 a year for an article in Science.
For one article?
Right.
Why is there such a premium on those particular journals?
Well, those particular journals, I mean, Nature has the highest impact factor. And if you go back to the Shanghai rankings are based on journal impact factor, and I think they even just count the number of publications in Nature and Science. I'd have to go back and look, but they're very targeted. And you see those institutions, I mean, really wanting to build their reputation and giving rewards for it. Now, I think it'll be interesting to see whether that was as crazy as it seems, in the sense that it's casual empiricism makes me believe that a lot of authors working in China right now are very much looking to people outside China to do research with. And there's strong incentives, right? I mean, I have a physicist friend in France who has published repeatedly in Science and Nature, and his email box often gets letters from people in China who would like to work with him. But some of the ideas, I think, have turned out to be pretty good. So maybe it helps you look outward, do you know? So it'd be interesting 20 years from now to see if it was as crazy as it initially seemed. However, I don't think that this policy was dreamed up for that reason. I think it was dreamed up because of the reputation attached to those journals.
So there are a fraction of scientists who feel that the luxury journal model is perverse because they have a high impact factor because they artificially restrict what they publish. So they only review 10% of submissions. And these decisions are made by editors, typically, not always scientists. Mm-hmm. So these are people who didn't pursue a career in science.
Right, or people who were not... I just quit. I was on the board of reviewing editors of Science for 7 years, and I just quit in May. So I have a lot of experience here. I think that once you have a journal that has a very low acceptance rate, you know, it helps your impact factor.
Sure.
In a way. But I also think that somehow these journals have become luxury goods, they have a history of publishing some very good things. Okay, I mean, I would not want to say that they don't have a history of publishing very good things, but they're also quite aware of the role they play, and they devote resources to being sure the public knows what's being published in these journals. And you know, for an economist, it's quite interesting because in economics, all journals are edited by practicing economists who are faculty members. And there's not a full-time editor who may have a PhD but is not doing research. So it's a different model.
See, that's what we look to. And the physicists also,
Right.
They do similar things. So why do we have non-scientists essentially making decisions about our careers, our promotion, our grants, and so forth? I know departments who will not look at a candidate unless they have a Cell Science or Nature paper.
I know that.
And that's not fair because there are very good papers published.
Well, and also
elsewhere.
I could show you data that I have a measure of risk that I created with Jean Wang and Racaniello Villiger at KU Leuven. And this measure of risk, when we correlate it with journal impact factor, the riskier papers are much less likely to be published in high journal impact factors. And also, they're much more likely to be at the top citations, but it takes 4, 5, 6 years before you see them. So all of these journal impact factors are short-term metrics too, okay? Anything that's a short-term metric has a different properties to it than things that take a longer view. And it really worries me for hiring young people and evaluating them.
I agree. I think that's the problem.
But I think that's a big problem.
I mean, right now, anything you write on CRISPR, you can get into Cell Science or Nature, which is silly because it's not all high impact.
Right.
So that's why many of us think this is a problem, but we have no idea how to fix it because China will always want to publish in Cell Science or Nature no matter what we do.
Well, I think it goes, I'd like to say, once again, I think a lot of this goes back to rankings. And once we've decided that this is the currency, the Shanghai rankings partly made it a more important currency. But once you have, most institutions in Europe now have a list for what people need to publish on. In Italy, I just come back from working in Italy. In Italy, you have to go before a national committee before you can put your name up to be promoted locally. And that's all bibliometric driven.
Let's talk a little about the workforce. You talk a lot about the role of foreign-born individuals in science in this country. So what's happening? Are they most of our biomedical workforce at the moment?
I haven't looked at the data really recently, so I'm not great at answering that. But the foreign-born make up about 43% of all people who get PhDs in all fields. Okay. And the field that has the highest rate is engineering and the physical sciences. The biomedical sciences, the percent has been growing. And I can't tell you at this moment what it is.
So does that have an effect on, say, salaries and competition of
Well, I
jobs?
think there's some pretty interesting work that I would suggest where you see the biggest impact of the foreign-born on salaries was for postdocs. And I would argue that because, a very large percent of postdocs are foreign-born. It's not only foreign-born who get their PhD here and stay for a postdoc, but it's foreign-born who get their PhD outside the U.S. and come for a postdoc. And I think I like to think of whether a supply is elastic. Elastic means that you don't have to increase the wage to get more people to come in. And I would argue that the supply of postdocs is almost infinitely elastic, means you can keep getting them at the same wage. And that's because of the large role of foreign-born. And George Borjas, who's at the Kennedy School, George did some work probably about 10 years ago now, that he estimates that postdocs were earning less probably because of the large presence of foreign-born. And I think that's very credible.
You make the argument that we need them to drive the workforce, right?
Well, I wouldn't just say to drive the workforce. I've done work with the late Sharon Levin that showed that a lot of exceptional contributions in science in the U.S. have been made by the foreign-born. Okay? And I truly believe that having a diversity of people working in any lab really increases creativity and productivity.
However, as you also say, since 9/11, it's been more and more difficult for foreign-born to get visas to work here. It takes longer and longer. They get frustrated.
Although things really improved after 9/11, a few years after 9/11, but I think things are not doing well right now.
Right. I hear stories wherever I go.
I hear lots
people
of stories
having problems, and you would argue that that's not good because we need the diversity of
I think
ideas.
we really need the diversity. I really do. And I also think that you see increasingly people who return, who've been educated here, but, they stay in it's circulation more than just a one-way street where you end up.
You mentioned the NIH is liking more and more bigger and bigger research groups, collaborations, program projects, U19 mechanisms.
Oh, they have,
I once asked Tony Fauci, what happened to the R01? And he said, well, we keep our eye on it, and when it gets low, and he didn't say what that number was, we'll do things. But do you think that the bigger grant mechanisms you get a bigger bang for them as opposed to the small ones?
Well, it's certainly, I think that NIH has drunk that Kool-Aid, shall we say, okay? I don't think there's, at least in the research I've read, I don't think there's strong evidence that that's so, but I feel almost, I once said that I think it's something that social scientists may have oversold, is that big collaborations may lead to increased productivity, because they also have huge coordination costs associated with them.
For sure. I mean, every big center grant has to have an administrator or multiple, which none of us with R1s have.
Right, absolutely.
Nor need. So I always wondered what was the evidence that they were more productive. Mm-hmm. I understand the idea of getting 5 people in different areas to solve a problem. That's fine. But to put more emphasis on it seems to me not really a good thing, but there's not much we can do about it. They have, without a change in the NIH leadership, we're stuck. But you don't see the evidence that it's more productive, right?
I haven't seen evidence. I can't think of a study offhand that has systematically done a good study of it. There have been a couple of studies funded by NSF that have looked at collaboration, but not at that large a scale.
And of course, you can carry people who are not productive in these big groups.
Yes, of course.
And because the groups are so big that they can absorb them.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we should mention that would be important for people to know that we haven't touched on? We've touched on a lot of things.
I just want to come back to the point that stabilizing the biomedical workforce, I think, is something that's very difficult to do, but could be very productive to the system overall.
How do we do that? You have suggested it, but how do we get people to listen who are going to change it?
I think that there are no incentives for one institution to do it by themselves. They'll be eaten alive by the competition. It's got to be something that comes down kind of from above, or that there's some commitment to it. And as far as I can see, that's not likely to happen.
I have an unrelated question. I heard an interview with an economist in the UK. Mm-hmm. She's Italian, Maria Mazzucato,
I know who she is,
who thinks that the NIH should get more money back from developments. Right? They should somehow get an investment return on when someone gets a patent. Because right now they get zero. Right?
Right.
What do you think about that? And she says, as a way to have more money to invest in research.
Well, I don't think I'm a fan of it, okay? I mean, I think the way the rules have been set up are pretty good. That the way the Bayh-Dole Act was written, universities will get some share of it, faculty will get some share of it. But I think once you have the NIH choosing who they're going to fund on the basis that, we might get a big return on this, I don't know whether I'm not sure that's the kind of incentive we want to create. I mean, that's why we think firms don't do basic research, because they're worried, I just think we need to think about the signal it sends.
Do you have any plans to make a new edition of the book and update everything, or is it too much? You're finished?
That book turned my hair from brown to white. I think I'm very happy with the book right now and doing other things, okay?
I still think everyone should read it, because even though it's a few years old, a lot of the principles are correct. And of course, you can always go to that website and see some new data, right?
Oh, yeah, there's lots of new data out there. So
the name of the book is How Economics Shapes Science. Does science drive the economy as well?
Well, I subtitle I almost put on it, How Science Shapes the Economy, but I took it out. Obviously, yes, science has a huge impact on the economy. But a lot of times it takes 30 to 40 years to see it.
Right, you do make that point.
Yep. Delay. There's a big delay, and anybody who thinks they're going to put money in and get it out in a year or so is going to be disillusioned, I think.
So here are a couple of quotes. Nowhere is the contribution of public research more clear-cut than the area of pharmaceuticals. And the investment in public water and sewer in the late 19th century did more than anything else in human history to increase life expectancy.
That's right.
My colleague Dixon Despommier says the greatest invention is the toilet.
Yeah. Well, and pipes. And
Pipes to
you know?
keep the sewage away from us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's really true.
That is our special episode of TWiV. You can find it at microbe.tv/TWiV. If you listen on your phone with a podcast player, please subscribe so you get all our episodes. And that way we know how many people are listening. It helps us to raise money. If you have questions and comments, send them to TWiV at microbe.tv. And if you like what we do, please consider supporting us. Go to microbe.tv/contribute. And there are ways where you could give $1 a month, which you can't really do much with, less than a cup of coffee, and it would help us very much. My guest today from Georgia State University, Paula Stephan. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Vincent.
I enjoyed it very much. I love what you're doing, and if I had known this, as I said earlier, I might not have gone in science because it's scary, but maybe I would have anyway. I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. I want to thank ASV and ASM for their support of TWiV and Ronald Jenkins for the music. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.